New digital scan of the Titanic has offered an unprecedented insight into the ship's final moments.
The key that sent the SOS. To me, that's a historical object. And I like the idea of having things that persist through time, that are carefully curated, that 500 years from now, people can still look at that key.
In the freezing dark of April 15th, 1912, as the Titanic slipped beneath the Atlantic, one room stayed alive until the very end. The room sent a desperate signal across the ocean. SOS, we are sinking fast.
The first thing we did, we went to where they gave us their SOS position and found nothing there.
Then it went silent. For over a century, that room, the Marconi Room, has rested in the icy darkness of the Atlantic. But now, after a new high-resolution scan of the wreck, explorers claim something impossible. The very device that sent the world's first maritime SOS may still be intact. This is how it happened. The night of the final transmission. The night was calm over the North Atlantic. The sea looked like glass beneath the cold April sky. The Titanic sliced through the water at 22 knots, carrying more than 2,200 passengers toward New York. Then, at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, a deep grinding noise broke the silence. The ship had struck an iceberg. The sound wasn't explosive, more like a long, heavy scrape, and most passengers barely felt it. But inside the small Marconi wireless room, two young men immediately understood the gravity of what had happened. Their names were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, both employees of the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company. Their job was to handle all of the ship's communications, telegrams from passengers, weather updates, and navigational warnings. Now, that same technology was the Titanic's only connection to the outside world. Captain Edward J. Smith rushed into the room and ordered them to send a distress call. Phillips adjusted the heavy brass key of the transmitter and began to tap. CQD, CQD, SOS. Come at once. We have struck an iceberg. Each series of dots and dashes pulsed into the darkness, leaping through static and distance across the freezing Atlantic. The letters CQD meant come quick, danger, while SOS was the newer, universal signal for disaster. It was the first time in history that SOS was used during an actual emergency at sea. The wireless room was cramped, hot, and smelled of burning dust. Sparks jumped across the transmitter's rotary gap, while the sound of the ship's dynamos hummed through the bulkheads. Every message drained more power from the Titanic's engines, which were already failing as the lower decks began to flood. Still, Phillips kept tapping, his hands trembling from the vibration and cold. Bride stood beside him, listening to the crackling in his headphones. Across the ocean, faint answers came through the static. The RMS Frankfurt, the Mount Temple, and the Olympic all received the distress call. The Frankfurt was roughly 170 miles away, the Mount Temple around 50 miles farther, and the Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, was over 500 miles distant, too far to help. Each operator replied, trying to get coordinates, but the static was brutal. Messages faded, broke apart, or vanished mid-transmission. Then, a clear signal came from the RMS Carpathia, a passenger liner operated by Cunard Line, about 58 miles southeast of Titanic's position. Its wireless operator, Harold Cottam, confirmed the message and reported that the Carpathia was turning around, engines pushed to full speed, cutting through the night toward the stricken ship. For a brief moment, relief flickered in the Marconi Room. Bride tried to joke, telling Phillips that someday people would talk about how they had made history. Phillips gave a tired smile but didn't stop working. The ship was sinking faster than anyone expected. Water filled the mailroom, the boiler rooms, and the forward cargo holds. The deck above them tilted, and the sound of panic grew louder as passengers scrambled for lifeboats. Cold crept into the wireless room as seawater flooded the decks below. Captain Smith entered again, his face ashen. He told them they had done their duty and ordered them to save themselves. Phillips ignored the order. He stayed at his post, tapping out messages to any ship that might be listening. Bride kept helping, wiping condensation from the instruments, wrapping cables, and repeating positions. When water began seeping under the door, Bride knew it was over. He shouted for Phillips to leave, but the older operator refused. As Bride climbed toward the deck, he looked back one last time. Phillips was still at the key, sending out one final call for help. Moments later, the power failed. The lights flickered twice, then went dark. The Marconi transmitter gave a faint crackle before dying completely. Above deck, chaos had taken over. The Titanic's bow was already under, and lifeboats were being lowered into the freezing black water. Passengers screamed, prayers mixed with the sound of tearing metal. Down below, the wireless room fell silent. Hours later, the Carpathia reached the coordinates Phillips had sent. They rescued more than 700 survivors from the lifeboats, but the Titanic was gone, along with both wireless operators. Decades later, when explorers sent cameras into the wreck, they found the Marconi Room still standing in silence. Inside the Marconi Room. The Titanic's Marconi Room was one of the most advanced communication setups ever sent to sea. It sat just behind the ship's bridge, close to the captain's quarters. The room was divided into 3 small but important sections: the main operating room, the transmitter or silent room, and the operator's shared cabin. Together, these spaces formed the ship's communication center and its link to the outside world. The system was built and installed by the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company, the same firm responsible for most early ship-to-shore radio systems. The Titanic's setup was almost identical to that of her sister ship, the Olympic, but had been slightly upgraded to reach farther distances. The new equipment allowed the operators to send messages over 400 miles, sometimes more under the right conditions. At the time, this was cutting-edge technology. The operating room was where most of the work happened. It was compact, about the size of a small office, and filled with polished wood, brass switches, and instruments that hummed softly when powered. On one side sat the Marconi key, the main tool used for sending Morse code. Next to it was the receiver, a set of headphones and tuning dials used to pick up faint signals from other ships or land stations. Above the workbench, neat rows of copper wires ran along the ceiling, carrying electrical power from the ship's dynamos. The light in the room came from small oil lamps and electric bulbs, casting a warm yellow glow on the brass fixtures. Behind a small door was the silent room. It was called that because the loud, crackling sparks from the transmitter could be contained inside, reducing the noise in the operating area. This space held the ship's rotary spark transmitter, a large, heavy machine that produced the radio waves. It worked by converting electrical current into bursts of energy, which was the sharp crack sound each time a message was sent. The system used direct current drawn from the ship's main dynamos. The electricity first passed through a transformer, which increased its voltage. It was then stored briefly in condensers, early versions of capacitors, before being released through a spark gap. The discharge created electromagnetic waves that traveled through the ship's aerial wires mounted high on the masts. Every spark carried a signal in the form of a sequence of dots and dashes forming words that could be read by trained operators on other ships. Working in the Marconi Room was not an easy job. The equipment generated heat and noise, especially when the transmitter was running at full power. Sparks would sometimes jump across metal parts, and the smell of ozone filled the air. Both operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked 12-hour shifts. During the day, they sent telegrams for wealthy passengers, like personal messages to family or business partners back on land. At night, they monitored navigation updates and weather reports from nearby ships. They had to stay alert at all times, since missing a single signal could mean missing a warning or distress call. Every few hours, the operators would check the transmitter coils, clean the spark gap, and ensure the condensers were properly charged. It was a routine, but it kept the system reliable. The Marconi Room was not just about technology, but about discipline and timing. A single error in tuning or power could block their signal or damage the equipment. When the Titanic sailed, few passengers realized that a small room behind the bridge carried the power to speak across the ocean. It was the most advanced wireless setup of its time, in a room that could reach the unseen world beyond the horizon. But to understand why this room mattered, you must step inside the device that survived itself, into the heart of the world's most famous transmission. Inside the heart of the radio set, the device. At the center of Titanic's Marconi system was a device that turned raw electricity into sound. It was a device that let a human voice, through code, cross the open sea. It looked simple at first: a few dials, coils of copper wire, and a humming motor. But together, these parts created one of the most advanced communication systems of its time. The system began with a motor generator, which worked like a heart-pumping electrical energy. It drew power directly from the ship's dynamos and converted it into the exact current needed to run the wireless set. The generator spun at high speed, creating a steady electrical flow that fed into the rotary spark gap, the true core of the transmitter. The rotary spark gap was a small spinning wheel with metal points along its edge. Each time the wheel turned, electricity jumped across those points in sharp, bright flashes. Every spark produced a burst of electromagnetic waves. These were invisible ripples that spread through the air and across the ocean. These waves carried the messages that the operators tapped out in Morse code. Each dot and dash was sent as a timed spark. The sparks passed through a tuned circuit made up of large copper coils and capacitors. These parts acted like filters, shaping the electrical bursts into a steady frequency of about 500 kilohertz, known as the maritime distress frequency. It was the standard signal used by ships around the world to call for help or send urgent messages. The next part of the system was the antenna. On the Titanic, it was an enormous structure. 4 thick copper wires stretched between the ship's 2 masts, rising nearly 200 feet above the deck. When the transmitter was active, the antenna glowed faintly with static, releasing the radio waves into the sky. This was the ship's voice, strong enough to reach hundreds of miles away, depending on weather and electrical conditions. Receiving messages was just as important as sending them. For that, the operators relied on a magnetic detector, often called the Maggie. It worked using a thin band of iron wires that passed through a small magnetic field. When radio waves from another ship arrived, they caused tiny changes in the magnetism of the wires. These changes were amplified and turned into faint clicking sounds in the operator's headphones. It was a sensitive device that required skill to tune properly. Too much current and it could burn out. Too little, and signals would fade. Together, the transmitter and receiver formed a two-way link between ships and land stations. This was decades before satellites, radar, or even reliable long-distance telephones. At the time, this setup represented the highest point of wireless engineering. It allowed ships to communicate across vast stretches of sea that were once completely silent. Despite its brilliance, the system demanded constant attention. The spark gap had to be cleaned regularly, coils had to be retuned, and the magnetic detector's iron band had to be replaced every few hours. Every operator who sat in front of it knew they were managing both precision and danger. The currents were strong enough to shock or burn. Yet for all its mechanical noise and flickering sparks, the machine carried human emotion through code, be it hope, fear, and final messages. When the Titanic began to sink, this same device sent out the distress calls that echoed across the Atlantic. It turned raw power into a cry for help that would be remembered forever, and that spark lit a revolution that would change communication forever. How the signal changed the world. One signal turned a tragedy into a turning point. When the Titanic's operators tapped out CQD SOS, they did more than call for help. They forced the world to listen. The transmission that night exposed how vital wireless communication had become and how unprepared the world was to use it responsibly. Before the Titanic sank, radio technology was still seen as an optional tool, more of a luxury than a safety device. Ships used it mainly to send passenger telegrams or navigation updates. Many vessels turned their wireless off at night to save power. When the Titanic's distress call went out, several ships nearby didn't even hear it because their operators were asleep or off duty. That failure changed everything. In the months that followed, governments, engineers, and the public demanded reform. The Radio Act of 1912 became law, marking the first global effort to regulate wireless communication. It required every passenger ship to maintain a 24-hour radio watch so that no distress call would ever again go unheard. Ships now had to carry backup transmitters and batteries, ensuring that even in total power loss, the radio could still function. This act also established designated frequencies, separating distress and navigation signals from personal messages. It was the foundation of the modern emergency communication system, and the reason distress calls today follow strict formats like Mayday or Pan-Pan. Titanic's signal turned scattered experiments into a coordinated international network. The tragedy also reshaped engineering priorities. Designers began building redundant systems into every critical machine on a ship, from antennas and power supplies to operator training. The Marconi Company expanded rapidly, opening schools around the world to train new generations of radio officers. Many students said they were inspired by the bravery of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the two Titanic operators who stayed at their posts until the end. The world quickly learned that wireless was no longer just about convenience, but about survival. Newspapers published stories on how the radio had saved hundreds of lives that night by summoning the Carpathia to rescue survivors. Within years, the word Marconi became as familiar as telephone or telegraph. Every major ship built afterward had a Marconi Room installed as standard equipment. The signal's influence stretched far beyond maritime safety. The same basic principles used in Titanic's spark gap transmitter evolved into shortwave radio, radar, and even early aviation communication. During both World Wars, wireless communication became the backbone of naval coordination and battlefield strategy. By the mid-20th century, radio waves were carrying voices, music, and news across continents. This was a direct legacy of the sparks that once flashed aboard the Titanic. The story also changed how people thought about connection itself. Before 1912, oceans felt like unbridgeable divides. After Titanic, the world realized invisible waves could carry human messages across any distance. A new era began defined by instant communication and the expectation that no one, no matter where they were, should ever be unreachable. But while the technology spread across the world, the original device that started it all, the Marconi transmitter, was gone. It sank with the ship, entombed in darkness nearly 12,500 feet below the surface. For decades, it remained unseen, its last message echoing only in history books. Yet the physical device that started it all, the transmitter itself, vanished beneath 12,500 feet of icy water, sparking one of deep-sea exploration's most haunting mysteries. Attempts to find the device and the controversy. When oceanographer Robert Ballard discovered the wreck of the Titanic in 1985, the world was stunned. Nearly 3/4 of a century after the ship went down, the myth had finally become real. Among the twisted beams and corroded hull, cameras caught a faint glimpse of the Marconi Room. Though the structure had partially collapsed, its outline was still visible behind the officers' quarters, in a haunting reminder of where the ship's final voice once spoke to the world. For decades after that discovery, the fate of the Marconi transmitter became one of the most debated mysteries of deep-sea archaeology. Some experts believed the device was long gone, crushed under collapsing decks, or dissolved by corrosion. Others argued that because the room sat deep inside the forward section protected by several bulkheads, key parts of the device might still exist. The thick iron of the hull and the cold, oxygen-poor water of the Atlantic could have slowed the decay enough to preserve traces of its structure. By the early 2000s, explorers using remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, brought back clearer footage. Inside what used to be the Marconi Room, tangled copper cables and broken insulators could be seen among debris. Some claimed they had spotted the base of the rotary spark transmitter itself, but no one could confirm it without entering the wreck, something international agreements strictly prohibited. That rule changed briefly in 2020 when RMS Titanic Incorporated, the company holding exclusive salvage rights to the wreck, announced an ambitious plan. They proposed to cut into the ship's deck above the Marconi Room and recover the radio transmitter before it disintegrated completely. Their goal was to display it in a museum as a piece of history, along with the machine that had sent the first SOS ever recorded during a real disaster. The company argued that time was running out. Deep-sea corrosion was eating through the hull faster than expected, and the radio components could be lost forever within a few years. The operation, they said, would be done carefully, using precision ROVs to minimize disturbance. Historians and engineers described it as a race against time. But the plan immediately drew strong backlash. Critics, including survivors' families, maritime historians, and several nations called it grave robbing. They argued that Titanic was not just a shipwreck, but a mass grave, and that cutting into it would disrespect the memory of the 1,500 lives lost. Conservationists added that deep-sea artifacts should remain in place, where they could be studied without removal. The UNESCO Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage supported this stance, pushing for protection over possession. Legal battles followed. In 2020, a U.S. federal judge initially granted RMS Titanic Inc.'s permission to proceed, citing the mission's educational value and the urgency of preserving history. But only months later, the U.S. Department of Commerce intervened, blocking the mission under federal law that protects the wreck as a maritime memorial. The COVID-19 pandemic then caused further delays, grounding expedition ships and cutting research funding. By the time the company renewed efforts in 2020, worsening storms in the North Atlantic and growing hull instability made physical entry even more dangerous. Engineers feared that drilling or cutting into the wreck could trigger a total collapse of the deck. In the end, the mission was suspended indefinitely. For many, the Marconi Room was the line between science and respect, showing that even in death, Titanic still stirred conflict between discovery and dignity. The wreck remained undisturbed, sealed beneath 12,000 feet of silence. Yet the story did not end there. In 2023, advances in underwater scanning and imaging offered a new way forward. Without cutting or touching the wreck, explorers could now see through layers of sediment and debris, mapping what lay hidden inside with precision down to the millimeter. This scanning technology revealed something no one expected: the scan that proved the device survived. In 2023, The long wait for clarity finally ended. The Magellan Limited Deep Ocean Mapping Project launched what became the most advanced 3D imaging survey ever attempted on the Titanic. Using a fleet of robotic submersibles equipped with ultra-high-resolution cameras and laser scanners, the team captured over 700,000 overlapping images of the wreck. For the first time, researchers could view every bolt, beam, and corridor of the ship as if it were floating in the open air. The results stunned the scientific world, and then they revealed something no one thought possible. When imaging specialists processed data from the section identified as the Marconi Room, they noticed something unusual. Behind collapsed walls and a tangle of cables, faint but distinct shapes emerged. They resembled the outlines of equipment long thought to have vanished. A motor generator casing, a coil housing, and the unmistakable spark gap mount of a radio transmitter. The patterns were too exact to be coincidence. Engineers compared them to archival blueprints of the original Marconi 5-kilowatt rotary gap transmitter used aboard the Titanic, and the match was almost perfect. For years, experts had assumed the equipment was lost to rust and pressure, but here it was, still recognizable after 111 years underwater. Analysis of the scan data revealed how it had endured. When the ceiling above the Marconi Room collapsed during the sinking, heavy steel beams had fallen across the transmitter table, pinning it down. Over time, these beams acted like a protective shell, shielding the machinery from strong currents and oxygen-rich water that accelerated decay elsewhere. Further examination of spectral data from the scan hinted at another surprise. The metal surfaces around the coils and casings reflected light differently from the corroded steel nearby. Metallurgists suggested that brass and copper components had resisted corrosion far better than expected, maintaining much of their form beneath layers of fine sediment. It meant that the core of the transmitter, the same machine that broadcast Titanic's last desperate calls for help, had not completely vanished. In interviews following the discovery, engineers confirmed that the remaining layout matched the original transmitter design used by Marconi operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. Every major element, from the generator base to the condenser rack, appeared in the same relative position shown in the ship's original electrical plans. This was amazing because for over a century, Titanic's radio had been an invisible relic of courage and tragedy. Now, it had resurfaced in digital form, its presence locked within millions of data points. What had once been only speculation was now visible proof. The world's first distress transmitter still existed, lying silent in the dark, exactly where it had last stood in 1912. The discovery sparked a new question, not only how it survived, but what this relic now means for history and preservation. Why it survived, and what it means for history. The survival of the Marconi transmitter after more than a century underwater is a story of science, chance, and material strength. Experts believe the key lies in the metals used to build it. The transmitter's core parts, which were made of brass, copper, and nickel, proved far more durable than the ship's surrounding steel. These metals corrode slowly in deep water, especially where oxygen levels are low. The transmitter's heavy copper coils and brass casing acted like armor, keeping its structure intact even as nearby furniture and walls disintegrated. Another factor was the ship's collapse itself. When the decks above the Marconi Room gave way, they created a protective chamber. The steel beams that buried the transmitter also sealed it from strong currents and scavenging organisms. Over the years, layers of fine silt settled across the wreck, forming an airtight seal that scientists call an anaerobic pocket. In this oxygen-starved environment, corrosion slows dramatically. What should have rusted away decades ago instead became locked in place like a natural time capsule frozen beneath the Atlantic. For researchers, the implications are remarkable. The Marconi set can now be 3D modeled and digitally restored using scan data, allowing historians and engineers to rebuild it virtually without disturbing the wreck. Every knob, wire, and coil can be recreated in full detail, offering a glimpse of how it once looked and functioned. This approach marks a new era in underwater preservation, one where technology replaces recovery, and history can be studied without intrusion. To maritime historians, the transmitter's survival changes how we see Titanic. It is no longer only a story of tragedy and loss. It also marks the birthplace of modern communication, the moment humanity realized that voices could travel across oceans without ships ever meeting. The Marconi Room was not only a control center, it was the spark that made global communication possible. Today, preservationists argue for virtual recovery, a method that protects Titanic's remains while still sharing its legacy with the world. The transmitter has become a symbol of endurance and connection, proof that even in disaster, communication triumphed. More than a century later, the world can still trace the echo of that night through a single device, the Marconi transmitter that refused to die, still lying in the dark, holding the last heartbeat of Titanic. What do you think about the Marconi Room? Comment down below.